This is Twisted Passages with award-winning author Marie Sutro. Now, let's take a deep dive into the dark world of psychological thrillers and meet the authors who created them.
Hello, and welcome to Twisted Passages. I'm your host, Marie Sutro, and today we'll be talking to critically acclaimed author Will Dean about his new release, The Chamber. Welcome, Will.
Thank you so much for having me, Marie. It's good to be here.
I am so excited that you're here. I finished the book, so I'm breathing again, which is a good thing because there was a lot of breath holding. But before we get into all of that spectacular stuff, can you start us off with an overview of the story?
Sure. So The Chamber is kind of And Then There Were None meets The Last Breath from Netflix. It's kind of an extreme locked room thriller. And for listeners and viewers to kind of imagine, if you can imagine you're in the middle of the North Sea on a ship, on a diving vessel, and you go below deck and there's this gleaming steel chamber. And the hatch is open, and you go through this, you kind of wriggle through this little hatch, and inside there are 5 other professional divers, and there's no room to move around. You're literally bumping into each other, and there's these really uncomfortable bunks, and that's pretty much it. And then that hatch is locked behind you. And then once you're inside, you're going to be in there for 28 days in this little chamber that's the size of a minivan or something like that. And they start to take out the nitrogen and replace it with helium. So everyone's voices start getting high, and it starts getting really hot and close and humid and uncomfortable. And you can't leave. You're going to be in there for 28 days. And if there's a problem, it will now take 4 days to decompress so that you can safely leave. That door cannot be opened. So whatever happens, you need to help yourself and the other divers. And then imagine how claustrophobic that is. And then imagine going through the next morning into another small room and into a smaller chamber, a diving bell, size of a small elevator. And this gets dropped through the center of the ship on a cable down to the bottom of the ocean. And you go down deeper and deeper and deeper. And you're kind of 350 feet down, and you look through the tiny porthole window, and it's dark because you're so deep, and it's just you and another diver. And this at this point, your diving buddy helps get your diving helmet on. They call it a hat. It weighs like 20 kilos. It weighs down on you. So you're hot, you're humid, you're uncomfortable, you've got no space. Then suddenly this huge helmet comes on top of you. And normally, to equalize, you'll pinch your nose. And that's what you do in the chamber. But in the diving bell, the small diving bell, in the helmet, you can't do that. So you have to push your face into the front of this helmet, into a little nook, so that it will pinch your nose. And that is all before A, you start work in the water, and B, before the first murder.
If anyone listening or watching is already holding their breath, then they're getting prepped. Because that's basically how this entire book goes. It is absolutely spine tingling. It is heart pounding. If you have never had a hint of claustrophobia in your life, you will appreciate it in this book. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with anything that scares me. You know, my ideas always come to me as I'm falling asleep. And a lot of bad ideas come to me as I'm falling asleep, but occasionally a good idea will come, and I know it's good because I kind of sit bolt upright again. It jerks me awake, and there's something that I'm uncomfortable with. And I never really write violence in my books. There's no gratuitous violence. It's more, I think as a reader, I'm obsessed with tension. This idea of Hitchcockian suspense. You know, this idea, and I know you're familiar with this as a writer, this idea of you can have a big explosion, and that's exciting for a few pages. But what Hitchcock taught us was you can have a bomb under a table ticking. And that's exciting for chapters and chapters and chapters, because it's not the big bang, it's the lead up, it's the anticipation, it's the clock ticking on the wall. So I wanted the idea that the clock on the wall here is the pressure coming down. and the fact that they can't get out, nobody can help them, the helplessness, and the idea of, I think all of my books are really about family and about control, being out of control, or even worse, being controlled. And here, the protagonist, Ellen Brooke, who's one of the only female saturation divers in the world, she doesn't know if the danger is coming from outside of the chamber, the people pumping in their gas that they're breathing, the people giving them their food and water and their medicine, or if it's someone, God forbid, one of these 5 other professional divers, because they rely on each other. There's this relationship of trust. And I thought psychologically, that's such an uncomfortable idea, that these people you rely on in a similar way to the military to watch your back and to save you if necessary, perhaps one of them you can no longer trust.
And that was one of the most brilliant things for me, was the concept of trust taken to such an extreme. And when you think about what that life is like for these saturation divers, as you mentioned, they are reliant on folks from the outside for the air they're breathing. They're reliant for every meal, but they're also reliant for instruction. And there's almost a complete, I don't think resignation is the right word, but they give over so much of their own autonomy,
Yeah,
to whoever's in their headpiece. When you talked about going down in the bell, so much of it is almost becoming childlike and just taking those instructions step by step, because as you explained so well, that's the only way to survive in those conditions.
100%. Exactly like you said, that relationship, that dynamic of trust and giving up autonomy is so uncomfortable for most of us. And giving up the ability to walk away from a bad situation. Like if I'm in a bad situation, I can just, we can leave. And in this situation, they have to just deal with it, and deal with it on a practical level, but also deal with it on a psychological level, going to sleep or trying to sleep in a bunk, because you can't really stay awake for 4 days. It's trying to sleep in a bunk when you know you might be trapped inside with a killer. That doesn't happen in other kinds of stories because you have the capacity to leave. So I wanted that dynamic where you have, like you said, you have to deal with it. And I think a lot of that came from my research and the idea that you are pretty helpless, but you have to stay calm. There are all these fantastically sinister phrases and sayings that I heard when I researched saturation divers. These things like, you can't get ahead of your hat, or supervisors saying to divers, take a minute for yourself, which sounds like a nice thing, but actually you're at the bottom of the sea and you're probably getting told that because your breathing is too fast or your heart rate is too fast, and they're worried for you because there are factual cases of divers who have the temperament. These saturation divers are at the apex of the diving world. They have the temperament of astronauts, these very cool, unflappable people. And there are recorded instances of people just losing their minds at the bottom of the sea. Totally understandably in my book, but like people at the bottom of the sea who have saturation dived for years or even decades, at the top of their game, and then suddenly they're working, they're welding 150 meters deep, and they just take off their helmet.
Well, I thought it was an absolutely amazing exploration into the human mind. In the beginning of that segment there, you talked about how you're trapped with these people, and you're not just trapped like you might be in a submarine, a military grade submarine where you can walk from one end to the other. Assuming the killer is inside, which you don't know if the killer is in or outside, you have to physically be in each other's space, right up within that zone of comfort. Lots of touching, lots of physical interaction as you pass by. That concept, the pressure, if we just put someone in a room and locked them in like that, let alone the physical pressure of the water around you, the pressure of having these gases come into your body. There's so much potential for not just violation of space, but violation of the person who you are, especially if you think somebody is killing your friends. And they're not just friends because, as you described, there's a brotherhood in a family. Even though Brooke is a female, she still uses kind of that old school nomenclature in the business, right? Everybody's a brother. The idea of having to suspect family and not trust family. Did you spend a lot of time? You talked about your research. Did you meet any of these folks? Did you talk to them a lot? People who had done this for a living?
I mean, I talked to people who did similar things or similar-ish things, like Navy clearance divers, and a lot of saturation divers were Navy clearance divers. So these guys were expert divers who were clearing ordnance, clearing bombs, unexploded bombs. Just an incredible. I mean, imagine being underwater and then being underwater breathing gas instead of breathing air. So you're deep underwater and you're in a war zone and you're trying to diffuse a bomb. I mean, I'm just a writer living in the woods off grid in Sweden. I have a very easy life and I have so much respect for these people who'd have to stay calm under pressure. So I found the whole, psychologically, I found the whole setup so fascinating and so full of menace and danger before there's even a criminal involved, that it was kind of intoxicating. I couldn't not write about it because on a psychological level, I was terrified before I, as the writer, got into this chamber. Yeah.
What fascinated me as well was that whole concept of ceding over autonomy, ceding over everything when you have Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None playing out. And for those who don't know, And Then There Were None, why don't you explain why the And Then There Were None reference?
So, And Then There Were None is my favorite Christie, and it's such a cool story. So it's basically I think it's a dozen guests are invited by someone to an island off the coast of the UK, and they all get there and they don't know each other. They're all strangers. I feel like I shouldn't even talk about it too much because it's kind of like, I don't want to give spoil. If you haven't read And Then There Were None, you should read it. But it's kind of, you can kind of, I think, understand what happens by the title, and
Yes.
it's kind of the same here. Yeah, exactly. It's this idea of there's something very bad going on and you don't know who's doing it, and you're in a very closed set. And I love a closed set, even if it's not actually a locked room, because it's a limited cast of characters. You know somebody's done it, you don't know who's done it. And in And Then There Were None, there's these strangers who all have very different backgrounds, and it's really interesting learning about it and learning about potential motives. But I wanted to take that to a different level where they've had at least years of trusting each other and vouching for each other in a similar way than you would find in the military. Like there is that brotherhood that you mentioned. There is that camaraderie. They all have saved each other in different ways. Maybe not like from a life-threatening incident, but they might have paid off somebody's debt from a gambling game or something like that. Because a lot of these guys and women are kind of wild people. They're very technically proficient, very intelligent, cool, amazing people, unflappable people. But often when they're on dry land, they're kind of living out this kind of outlaw lifestyle. A lot of them have trouble with the law. A lot of them just are very free and wild in a way that my author friends and I are not. So they're quite fun to imagine what they're like. Yeah, a lot of saturation divers, for example, they earn a lot of money relative to their peers, and they spend it all. They tend to spend it all. They tend to be terrible at like financial planning. They tend to just kind of live fast, die young, unfortunately. But they're such an interesting group of people.
Well, when you mentioned why you like it, the fact that you have this limited cast of characters, and we add all the intense elements to this particular story you've crafted, what was so fun was listening. And I found myself listening a lot to the characters, which is fun because as a reader, you think it's all about your eyes. But somehow you start listening in the process. You're opening up those parts of you that are really more functional when you're listening. And a great example of that is the stories upon stories upon stories. And again, that kind of harkens back to me, my thoughts about even going back to the pirates, the folks out on the sea were always great yarn spinners, right? And you have these characters who've been through some things and they're telling stories, situations they've been through, things their friends have been through. And as you explain, there's reasons for that. One is it passes time. There's nothing to do in this little capsule. But the other is a function that is really a life-saving function and a sanity-saving function, which is to keep people engaged and keep their mind off the fact that they're stuck in a capsule. How did you come up with those stories? Because like I said, I was listening, trying to think, okay, is it one of you? Is it you? What does this story say about you? Are you a good guy, a bad guy? What did you do in this situation?
That's a really good point that you make about the kind of listening dimension of this. Yeah. And also, within the book, on a kind of a meta level, the characters realize that everything they say is being listened to as well from everybody outside. They don't know if they can trust these people, and they can't really have a dialogue about that problem because the dive supervisors and the life support technicians outside are also listening in. But in terms of the stories, it's exactly like you say, like they need to pass the time, they need to get through it. And psychologically, they need to leave the chamber. They can't physically leave, but they can travel in time and space, just like we do when we read and write novels. So they need to get their head out of that chamber. And they do so by, I think, sharing these stories, which to you and me seem very dark and sinister, but to them, they have this kind of dark humor that allows them to get through these situations, which is something common to law enforcement and the military and doctors and nurses. It's just something to. My sister was a paramedic, and she kind of said the same thing. They have this humor that you couldn't share with civilians. They wouldn't make sense to anybody else, but that's the way they deal with situations. And these stories, another aspect of it is that if it's a personal story, they survived the story. They got through that tough time, and I think that gives them a little bit of hope when there wasn't much around. But I must say that as a storyteller and a reader and a film lover, it was also inspired by that scene in Jaws when it's really looking bleak and impossible, and they're out at sea, isolated, the three of them, and they start sharing stories and showing their scars. So I wanted this to be that, but without showing physical scars, but more showing psychological scars.
And it's interesting because in those places, in that darkness that they're revisiting in telling these stories, there is hope and strength and so many other things that can be inspiring to you if you're sitting in that situation saying, wow, these other people went through that. And not to say that we should ever be comparative, but there is a piece that's comparative where we think, oh, wow, there are people who survived these things. Maybe I can do it too. And I think that's kind of that respect for life's not easy.
Yeah.
And these people are putting themselves in incredibly tough situations every day. Getting back to that whole idea of the structure of the story, where your inspiration came from. I was a huge fan in the 80s of the movie The Abyss because it was underwater, tons of pressure, lots of breathing issues, and suspense around every corner and suspicion around every corner. Did that movie influence you at all? Did you have any exposure to that, kind of leading into this as a reference point or departure point?
100%, I did. My father really liked that film, and I liked it very much as well as a kid. And that was an unconscious influence, I think, on this story. And it also made me realize that I need to get all the technical details correct, because in that movie, famously, it's a really good movie, but a lot of the technical details are incorrect with regards to diving. So that was a good nudge for me to make sure I get the technical stuff as correct as I possibly can. But and I do like that film a lot. But the other And that idea of there's an unseen menace, you don't know what's controlling you. This in that film, it's a very different outcome. But I do like that feeling of being so out of your comfort zone and you don't know what's going on. But then the other film that really influenced this was Alien, which I think is a really beautiful film. And I watched it so much as a kid, far too young. I read Stephen King too young, and I watched Alien too young. And that idea that you're trapped on this little spaceship in deep space with this apex predator, and you can't get away, you can't really get out. It really stuck with me. And then this book is kind of an homage to that. This book and my last book, The Last Passenger, the last one, it's called in the US. The last one, the protagonist is called Kaz Ripley. And in The Chamber, the protagonist is called Ellen Brooke. And if you put those names together, you get Ellen Ripley. So it's kind of my little Easter egg saying thank you for Alien. But yeah, that dynamic is, and the interesting thing about saturation divers is they compare themselves to astronauts. But the way they talk about it is like, well, if you're in the International Space Station, you get a leak, you can patch the leak. If we get a leak, we all die instantly. And they have this phrase, which some saturation divers do use, raspberry jam, which is a horrible phrase, but it's so like, it just, exactly what they mean instantly. And they talk about the fact that in space, if you're on a spacewalk and you're trying to fix a piece of the solar panel, you have perfect clear vision and you have nothing, there's no like friction. Space is a vacuum, so you can move easily when you're trying to fix something. At the bottom of the ocean, often you have zero visibility, and it's hard work because there's 100 meters of water pressing down on you. But not only that, on a spacewalk, you kind of know what you're going to get, whereas at the bottom of the sea, suddenly when you're busy welding or trying to loosen a bolt on an oil manifold, you can suddenly feel some huge living thing brush past the back of your legs, and that doesn't happen in space, hopefully not. So it's the way they describe that it was so interesting, and it kind of made me realize that they have it worse, I think, at the bottom of the sea. And I fly often. I fly like every month. I live off grid in Sweden, but I fly to events in the UK and around the world. And when I fly, I always fly over the North Sea now, and I always look down at that huge canvas of water, and I just think about there's like a dozen or 2 dozen humans down there at the bottom of the sea on their own, working away. It's just amazing to think about.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. These workers are pipeline workers, oil pipeline workers, and I think when we think about oil and natural gas and things like that, we rarely ever think that there's people who have to go maintain those lines under the bottom of the sea. So the fact that this really shed a light on people who are so integral to the way that the entire globe functions in our era, that they're out there and that really they're kind of unsung heroes putting their life on the line every day so that the rest of us can just live our modern conveniences.
100%. And they probably wouldn't see themselves that way because they get paid really well. And they would probably say that actually there's like, let's say there's 12 saturation divers on a ship and there's 100 people up in the actual ship. They're the unsung heroes because they're keeping the divers alive to work on the seabed. And a lot of those guys, deckhands and stuff, they're not getting paid very much at all. So often, humbly, they'll say they're not the heroes because they're really well paid. It's actually the people on the ship keeping them alive who are the heroes. But you're absolutely right. Like in the Gulf of Mexico right now, there are dozens of saturation divers right now as we talk from the comfort of our homes. They are down at the bottom of the sea in the Gulf of Mexico. There are people in the Caspian Sea. There are people in the Far East, in Australia, off the coast of India, in the Red Sea. It's just so interesting that this is a secret club of very calm professionals. It's an interesting group of people for sure.
Yeah, I do not do well in submarines. I've visited historic submarines that are just sitting right below the waterline at different maritime museums. And I cannot imagine even some historic aircraft carriers I've been on where they show those bunks that are just, and I just think how, but people do this and it happens. And I just really have such a greater appreciation than I ever did for my personal space after reading your book.
100%. I agree completely. I live in a huge forest in Sweden with nobody else here. So it's very, very, very different, very open. And I probably live here partly because I'm kind of a hermit by nature, but also I like the space. I like the freedom and the silence. And in a chamber like that, I think Ellen says in part of the novel that you have to kind of move around within your own head, within your mind. That's the only place. So you'll remember things, you'll think through things, you'll close your eyes. And it's written in kind of the early 2000s. So there are no iPads back then. There are no people, there's no phone scrolling. So they're just sitting there kind of reading and trying to find their next job because they're all kind of contract workers. And also, yeah, disappearing into their own thoughts. And I wanted to also explore the idea that, okay, can I trust the people outside the chamber who are working to keep me alive? Can I trust the people inside the chamber? And can I trust myself? So after 2, 3, 4 days of not sleeping properly, not really eating any food, and the constant stress of this menace building, can I trust myself at this point?
And that's the best, when you're looking at yourself and thinking, wow, I'm an unreliable narrator in my own story. Can I trust my own thoughts? That's one of the scariest things that you can ever conceive of. You just gave so many chills and thrills, mastery of the slightest movement, hand movement, facial expression, facial tick, creaks in the capsule, all of that. Oh gosh, it was just hair raising from beginning to end. So I have to ask you, you mentioned where you live. You're writing intense suspense. What do you do to have fun, Will? Because this is serious stuff.
Well, I think, I'm a lighthearted guy. I think I get all my darkness out on the page. So, we live here. I've got my family here. We have a very outdoors life. We have a huge St. Bernard, kind of like a Beethoven kind of character. He's wonderful, big Norwegian forest cat. And I chop a lot of wood because I have to, because that's how we heat and cook and heat our water. So we live a very quiet life, or we did until I started getting published, and then I have to travel all of the time to see readers and do events. But we have a very normal life here. I'm very satisfied hiding away, reading and writing all of the time. So what I do really for fun is read great writers. That's what I do. I'm really inspired by Cormac McCarthy, who would hide away in the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. And he was so good from the get-go, but then he was like, no, I'm not going to do any media. I'm just going to work away in this academic institute with these scientists and writers, and I'm going to work on my craft for the rest of my life. And that's what he did. He was hiding away there, working on his craft. And I admire that so much when you're as good as he was, and then you're like, no, I'm just going to try and get a little bit better.
Well, I kept thinking about the stories within the stories, the stories that these divers are telling each other. And I reflected once I finished the book, and I thought, wow, these stories are in many ways, they're mental and emotional lifelines in that situation. And I've always known how much, since I was a huge bibliophile from a very young age, and I've always known how important reading was to me. But your book kind of helped me put it in context, because the stories within stories being a lifeline, life is hard, and picking up a book and getting to hear that story the same way we listen to Jumbo or any of the other characters telling their stories, that's what gives us a lifeline. So thank you for taking the time and putting in the effort, the painstaking effort, amazing research that went into this, and your skill and artistry. Absolutely amazing story. Thank you so much.
Well, that's extremely kind of you. Thank you very, very much. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. It's nice that we've gone deep on craft and on the intricacies of storytelling. So thank you so much.
Well, I absolutely loved this book. And I know tons of people obviously are your fans already, and there's going to be tons more based on this book. Where is the best place, Will, that people can find you out there and find out where you're going to be and what's coming next for you?
So you can find me on Twitter or X or whatever it's called, and Instagram. I think I'm at Will R. Dean. It's a lot of St. Bernards, a lot of forest life, and a lot of books I like reading. Mainly St. Bernards. And then I'm also on YouTube. I have a channel called Will Dean, Forest Author, or Will Dean. I'm not sure what it's called, but it's basically just me trying to give tips to new writers, because I remember how hard it was at the beginning. It's still hard now, but it's so hard at the beginning when you feel like the industry is this impossible thing to break into, and you have all these questions. And I remember being in the query trenches for years, and it was so hard, and you kind of like, is this ever going to happen? And does everybody who have an agent have a contact with someone? Because this seems impossible. So I wanted to put lots of like just little practical tips and bits of reassurance as well, because confidence is so important at that stage, or at all stages. Like, it's so easy to lose all confidence. So I just wanted to put that out there on that YouTube channel for people who are coming through and who have no contacts like I had, because it seems overwhelming. And it seems like, especially here in the woods, I felt like the literary scene in New York and in London was like a different world. So that's what that channel is about. So I'm on, I think Instagram, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I'm hoping that in addition to the St. Bernards, sorry for my American pronunciation,
I like it.
I am hoping that there are Norwegian forest cat pics in there as well, because those are amazing, as well as the St. Bernards. And I hope that
there's a lot of that. My cat is called Monty. He's the size of a small dog, actually. He's a big cat, and there's plenty of Monty there too. Yeah.
Outstanding. Again, the book is called The Chamber. You will not be disappointed. It will make you hold your breath from start to finish and give you a lot to think about in between and afterward.
Thank you, Marie.
Thank you, Will, for joining me today. And thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you next time on Twisted Passages.